Welcome. My name is Mike Kinman. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the rector here at All Saints Church. It's good to be here this morning, and it's a hard morning. And I think that's probably an incredible understatement. It's possible that some of you are, especially those online, are just waking up and have not heard the news. Less than 5 miles from here last night at a ballroom dance studio in Monterey Park, there was a mass shooting. There was a massacre. At least 10 people were killed. More were injured in something that comes in the midst of a celebration of the Lunar New Year in the middle of a large AAPI community. And it is devastating, it is infuriating, and there's a lot of other terms that we're going to kind of fill in the blanks for. And so this forum is part of a series called The Other America. Last week we had a fascinating conversation about housing disparity and injustice in the African American community, and looked at the history of that nationally and also locally. Today we are blessed to have two remarkable activists, scholars, artists, Jason Chu and Sissy Trinh. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. And we were going to talk about, ladies and gentlemen, your senior warden. And we were going to talk about, we are going to talk about housing disparity and discrimination in the AAPI community. But we need to talk about what happened last night. Because this is not the first time this has happened, and this is an event that cuts deeply. And I particularly want to thank you both, Jason and Sissy. This is really raw and fresh, and just even for your willingness to come here and be here and talk this morning. And I hope we can hold each other in love and grace, because we're kind of in a grieving space right now. So, Jason, I'm going to start with you, let you introduce yourself, and just kind of talk about what's on your mind and on your heart this morning.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and thank you, folks, for having us here today. My name's Jason Chu, he, him, his. I'm a rapper and community artist, activist, educator. This is gonna be interesting because. You know, for those of you who do or don't know, there was. I was about to sleep last night before, get my full 8 before coming here and sharing, and then right as I was going to sleep, my friend Tammy, who's co-founder of Hate is a Virus, this 501c3 I work with, texted me to see if I was okay, and I was like, oh God, what happened? And then I was up, and. It's so, okay. This is not new, is what I want to say. This is not new. Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities, frankly, exist as a product of violence. We exist in response to violence. I always think, why do people leave where they were to go to a place that's unfamiliar and scary, right? And the propaganda of American empire is that people come seeking opportunity. The reality is, why don't those opportunities exist elsewhere? Christian nationalism, white nationalism, says that it exists because this country is favored by God. Say that it exists because of the favor of God on this nation. And that's blasphemy. Because we know that opportunities are taken from certain places and relocated other places, not because of the hand of God, but rather because of Satan, because of the satanic drive to take from some and to relocate and to concentrate and to center in other places. Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities exist as they do in the modern day because of violence. This goes from the Opium War in China, which was fought so that the British Empire could peddle drugs to a country's own citizens. And when the country pushed back against that, a war was fought, destabilizing the nation, driving people to mass migration because of satanic greed. Modern day, the American state of Hawaii exists because of a similar violence, exists because adventurous, frankly, in naming it, white adventurous with ties to mainland or U.S. continental politics and money saw an opportunity for resources and seized it. And that led to the overthrow of a popular monarchy and the construction of a puppet state, which was then absorbed into the U.S., right? And we can go on and on. Modern day Korea, modern day Vietnam, Los Angeles is home to an incredibly diverse AAPI population, which includes so many Southeast Asian communities. Why are these communities here? Why do they leave? Why do so many people en masse? There are, I think, something like 50,000, 100,000 Mien people in America, up and down the West Coast. They're here because they were recruited by the U.S. as allies in the secret war in Southeast Asia when the U.S. had political interests in maintaining, in destabilizing communist, socialist, Marxist regimes, and in installing favorable governments. What did this do to the people who fought alongside them? They had to leave their homelands. Communities, families, tribes, nations, cultures that had existed for thousands of years were torn apart by satanic greed. It can go on and on. I want us to know that when we talk about Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander populations, frankly, even within our communities, there's so much relearning to do because, and this is something spoken of by so many race scholars and critical theorists, is from birth, those of us who've grown up under American empire, we never see ourselves. There's always, to quote Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? There's always something between the world and me, right? There's always this filter. And so we're taught actually a colonized falsehood of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders. There's so much that is beautiful, rich, wealthy that comes from the culture. But there's also so much imposed on us by circumstance, by society, by the market forces. And I call them market forces, not just political or social forces, because it's driven by capital, right? And there's so much placed on us by the market forces that instrumentalizes our bodies and communities, that takes an imagination of us and feeds it to us. So I'm Chinese American. My dad is Thai. He came from Bangkok. My mom is Malaysian. She came from Kuala Lumpur. They both came for college. They're both first generation. They had me when they were in grad school, and they homeschooled me. And I always wondered, why did they homeschool me? And my sister and I thought it was because our mom was very controlling, which she is. That's part of it. But increasingly, and I talked to her. I asked my mom 2 years ago, why? And she said, you were enrolled in pre-kindergarten at a Christian school, at a Christian kindergarten at the church we were going to at the time. And you started coming home and saying certain things and acting certain ways. And there was, I'll be very transparent, there was one time she said that was the straw for her to say, this may not be it, Chief. She said, there's one time you came home and you said, oh, you know, and I did this, you know, I did the slant-eyed gesture. And she said, where did you learn that from? And I was like, oh, you know, there's just Mike Webb or whoever, whatever kid. And she said, that was when we decided that we were going to raise you ourselves because we were afraid of what you could become if you were just sucking all of this in with no filter. And so there's been an act of terrible violence last night at 10:22 p.m. in Monterey Park, just a few miles away from us. There have been systemic acts of violence always and every day, right? And gun violence is a scourge and is a wickedness that we see, and it's visible, and it's instantaneous, and it's horrible. Housing, which Sissy and Sika are so passionate about, right? Housing. There are so many ANHPI elders, and not just elders. There's so many folks in our community, and this is not an oppression Olympics thing, right? I'm not saying we got it worse than nobody else. I'm not saying that we got better than nobody. This is just what we have in our community. Is there's violence every day, and sometimes the violence isn't as loud and as easy to point at as a person walking into a place and shooting it up, right? Sometimes the violence is the slow drip of microaggressive trauma. The notion of microaggression actually has really been pushed forward by Asian American psychological scholars. It was Daryl Wing Su, and then more recently, Kevin Nadal and E.J.R. David, these Filipino scholars who have done research and have concluded that the microaggressive racism that people face day in, day out and begin to expect and it begins to shape them, it actually has more ties to PTSD symptomatology than combat experience. To be visibly Asian, to be visibly othered, is a combat experience, is a violent experience. It's not as sudden as gun violence. And I am gonna wrap quick because I could go, but the last thing I want to say before we transition is a plea, and whether you aren't a NHPI or you are, a plea to imagine justice that includes ANHPI communities. Rage Against the Machine famously pointed out, you know they went after King when he spoke out on Vietnam, all right? Malcolm X famously was influenced and inspired by Asian socialist movements. The Asian American term originated in a movement called the Third World Liberation Front, a liberation front for all of those, a movement for all of those who feel marginalized, exploited, and used under the current system of capital and power. And please, when we imagine justice, whether that's gender justice, whether that's reproductive rights, whether that is housing, whether that is police brutality, whether, and there's so much more we could go on, but please, when we have these conversations, try to imagine or to reimagine how all of them, AANHPI communities, are not only impacted by these convos, but allies and in solidarity and moving towards the beloved community that the Reverend Dr. King spoke about.
Thank you. Sissy, you want to introduce yourself and then what's on your mind and heart this morning?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me here today. My voice is probably going to crack a bit, and I'm going to go off. My name is Sissy Trinh. I'm the Executive Director of SICA, the Southeast Asian Community Alliance. And we were founded about 20 years ago to do youth after-school programs and youth organizing around API, racial justice, and economic justice issues. And then 2020 happened. And we had to pivot, and we became a COVID emergency relief organization pretty much overnight. We work in the neighborhood of Chinatown, and what a lot of people don't know is Chinatown's among the most poorest neighborhoods in the city of LA and the most environmentally vulnerable in the state. And a lot of that has to do with a legacy of like racist land use and development that predates redlining, for those of you who know what that is, by like probably about 50 or 70 years. Part of the reason why we became a COVID relief organization is that the county wasn't translating outreach materials into Chinese. You know, really rare language. And of course, all of our folks were getting their COVID information from their neighbors, from like WeChat, from God knows where. And you remember the early days of the pandemic, we were all kind of like, stick your groceries in your garage for 3 days, right? Like all kinds of crazy information. Now imagine if you're not getting any official sources, right? And so that's kind of why we started distributing, you know, flyers from Orange County's public health department, because LA wasn't doing it. And whatever PPE we could get, you know, remember when everybody was like, you only get 2 bars of soap per person. And I was like, I have to buy for 400 households. How am I gonna do this, right? Overnight, like I got really good at logistics. And in the midst of all of this is this rising tide of anti-Asian hate, right? Which was largely unacknowledged until the mass shootings in Atlanta, right? And it took a mass shooting for people to realize, oh, anti-Asian racism exists. And this wasn't just like mainstream folks, elected officials. This was other racial justice allies. These were people who were like, I am a Black Lives Matter supporter, or I'm, you know, and I'm like, you know, prior to Atlanta, when I would call them out on their anti-Asian racism, they were like, I'm centering blackness. And I'm like, no, 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 no. You can do both, center blackness and not perpetuate anti-Asian racism, right? They're not mutually exclusive, right? But people couldn't envision that anti-Asian racism was anything, that it was not important, right? For us, what was really challenging was to get people to understand that it's not just about hate violence. It's about economic justice. It's about immigration. It's about policing. All of these things that exist and that low-income Black folks experience, low-income Asian folks experience too. There's nuance and there's differences, but it exists, right? And I think what was really hard was like, right after Atlanta, we got approached by all these elected officials and community leaders and philanthropy, and we were being offered all this money to work on anti-Asian violence, right? And I had to say no. And it wasn't that that's not important in our communities, because a lot of our seniors were getting targeted in Chinatown, right? We had to say no because for me, we're a staff of 5, first of all. We're like tiny, and we're doing stuff in like 5 different languages. We had to make a choice. Do we work on anti-Asian violence, or do we prevent our folks from dying of COVID? Because the vast majority of our residents are essential workers, or they're working in industries where minimum wage is an aspiration. Like a lot of our high school students think a good job is a minimum wage job because their parents are working in sweatshops, they're working in restaurants, they're working in industries where they're getting paid $2 to $3 an hour, right? They're living in overcrowded housing, and they're on the verge of becoming homeless. So like we've written rent checks for seniors and families that can't afford a $4 a month rent increase, right? Last year, I wrote a rent check for $192. And a lot of our families can't access the emergency rental assistance programs that the city and the state have created, right? So for example, the state's website, first of all, a lot of our folks don't have access to tech. You know, we're dealing with a lot of low-income seniors who don't know what the internet is, let alone have access to computers. But so the online translation for the state's emergency rental assistance program at one point translated, you know, go back to your county, right? Like, because some counties opted the state to do the program. Other counties did it in-house. So LA did it in-house, right? The direction in Chinese for the state program was go back to your country. Yeah. And so, like, again, we had to choose. Do we try to keep people alive and protect them from COVID, or do we protect them from hate and violence, right? And it's not a choice that I ever want to make, but I have to make every day, right? And it's really fucking hard. Sorry. I curse a lot. I shouldn't as someone who runs a youth organization, but I do.
You know, when the conditions are obscene, obscenity is just appropriate.
Yeah. And so, like, I think one of the things that I was struggling with when I spoke to, Father Mike this morning was, we can't just talk about API housing issues, without acknowledging what's going on. But how do I connect that thread, right? How do I make those connections when I'm still struggling and reeling, and you can probably hear it in my voice, about what's going on, right? And for me, it's like, hate violence is really easy to talk about in a certain sense because this person is evil. We know that. Nobody debates that. Nobody questions it. But what about the landlord that acts in a predatory manner against low-income API seniors, right? And what if they're Asian too, right? Like, it's not just about race, it's about race and class and immigration and all of these different things and how we perpetuate violence against each other as fellow Asians, right? Or as landlord to tenant, right? Like, I remember a situation where there was this one landlord in Chinatown. So a lot of our residents live in what are called SRO, single room occupancies. They're largely housing of the last resort. Think about it like a college dorm, right? Where you rent a room and then you share bathroom facilities and kitchen facilities with everyone. But it's for super low income people, right? It's for people who don't have anywhere else to go. Because they can't afford, these rents are like around $300 to $500 a month. And this landlord basically told, some of these low income, they were seniors, they were disabled tenants, hey, I need you to move out for just the weekend so that I can like fix the bathroom or whatever it was. So they leave, I don't know where they stay, and then they come back and it turns out that the landlord didn't renovate the building, he just changed the locks and dumped all their stuff on the street, right? And mind you, disabled, don't speak English, and a lot of times when I talk to people who are like, who minimize our housing justice issues, they're like, well, why don't they just move somewhere cheaper, right? And I'm like, these are seniors who can't afford a $4 a month rent increase. How are they gonna find first and last month's rent? They can't afford to hire movers, right? And a lot of them are disabled, right? So, like, they can't move on their own. We have a lot of residents who buy rice by the cup, because they physically can't carry and store more than that, right? And so when the early days of the pandemic, and all the elected officials were, the lead communities were saying, buy groceries 2 weeks at a time. I'm like, how are these seniors that can't carry 2 pounds of rice gonna buy 2 weeks worth of groceries, let alone store it, right? Because, these are buildings where you have like maybe 20 or 30 tenants sharing one kitchen and one refrigerator, right? And so then, of course, the state created this program called the Great Plates program, and it was free meal delivery for low-income seniors, except our seniors were too poor to qualify. Like, I literally begged the mayor's office for the city of LA, like, give them these meals. I'm not talking about every Chinatown senior, I'm just talking about the ones in the SROs, right? Like, and the response was to give me the number to the Sikh temple, right? And so I kind of talk about all of these things. It's just like examples of how our folks get excluded because, one, the assumption that hate violence is the only kind of violence perpetuated in our communities, right? And that the assumption that otherwise we can take care of it ourselves, right? And I think that's what frustrates me so much about the whole conversation around gun violence and about just violence in general in this country is we need to take care of it on our own. No, these types of issues are systemic and require systemic interventions, require the government to step in and to protect us. not over-police us, right? Because that's the reality too. And I think that was what was frustrating to me during all of this conversation around anti-Asian violence, was how the folks who are working on carceral reform didn't see it as an opportunity, right? Because the thing is that after Atlanta, like, you know, the sheriff, the chief of LAPD, and the mayor came down to LA Chinatown and did like photo ops and stuff like that, and talked about bringing more policing into this neighborhood. And I was like, dude, for the people who are, you know, the Black Lives Matter folks, like, this is an opportunity to build allyship, to help build capacity for APIs to say, more police isn't making us safer, right? And connecting anti-Asian hate violence with over-policing of Black communities. That didn't happen, again, because a lot of our supposed allies didn't see us as allies. They saw us as white adjacent, as props for, you know, like the racist white supremacist system. And I was just like, damn, missed opportunity to kind of thread all these issues together. These are things I think about in the middle of the night. I have no solutions. Because again, we're still trying to keep our folks from becoming homeless, you know, and trying to provide rental assistance. Last year, I wrote, I paid rent for, or Sika paid rent for an entire building in China. I felt like one, you know those billionaires that you see who pay, who do like speak at a graduation ceremony for some college, and then they're like, I paid for all your student loans. Like, I felt like that. But of course, context is very different. You know, kids with like $60,000 in student loan debt versus disabled and low-income seniors living in SROs, right? And by the way, it was less than $10,000. That's how cheap their rent is, right? That's how cheap it is to keep these people from becoming homeless. But we don't invest in those systems because we can't imagine it, because we can't imagine that there would be poor Asian folks, or that maybe people are poor because we have a shitty social safety net, right? Because these are seniors living on SSI. They're 90 years old. We're not gonna be able to job train them out of poverty. They can't work. They're dumpster diving to be able to like make $2 to have a meal for the day, right? So we need to really do better, and we need to demand our government does better.
Thank you. First of all, thank you both. Just we really just have a few minutes left. I'm wondering if we can talk about some of the history and some of the structures. I mean, because housing is important, because housing touches so many things. It impacts social mobility, it impacts economic mobility, impacts education, it impacts healthcare. You know, it is this thread that goes through everything. And you mentioned that there were policies in place before redlining. Can you just sort of talk a little bit, and maybe, you know, Jason, feel free to jump in. How did we get where we are today?
So Chinatown was created under a policy that, you know, could be described as containment. The idea that, so with redlining, it's basically like you can't live anywhere north of here. With Chinatown, it was established in, I think, like the 1850s. Asians are only allowed to live in this like 6-block area, and only allowed to work in this 6-block area and, you know, shop in these areas, right? And of course, they couldn't own property. And so why that is important is because over the decades and over the past century, Chinatown has been home to among the first freeways in this country, among our heavy rail system, and our regional prison system, right? And so when we talk about like racist land uses and why do our communities get freeways, why do our communities get factories? Oh yeah, all of our factories are also in Chinatown. So that's why, you know, it's the most polluted neighborhood in the county, right? It's because of a history of decisions that were made 100 years ago to put freeways here, to put factories, to put our regional prison system. They're not accidental, they're intentional, right? And over and over and over again, like city leaders and county leaders would continue to choose to place these things. And so if you look at the LA Times, right around the time that they were debating where to place Union Station, the narrative around where to put it and how they described Chinatown. So Chinatown used to be known as, in English, N-word alley. And then in Spanish, it was Calle de los Negros, right? And they would talk about it, why we should build Union Station in Chinatown, because we need to demolish all those opium dens and those brothels. And at one point, Asian Americans were cheap labor. And so when you have a lot of folks of a specific ethnic group being cheap labor, it comes with all of this like racial language to kind of justify them being exploited, right? That they're uneducated, that they're like, unchristian, like fill in the blanks. And so that's kind of how Chinatown came about. And so it's really interesting for us to kind of think about in that context, because we work a lot with folks in Skid Row. A lot of our residents are socioeconomically more similar and face similar struggles to the housed residents in Skid Row than they do the low-income families in like Boyle Heights or like South LA, right? Our folks are too poor to also qualify for affordable housing, FYI. And so, Skid Row was definitely created as a containment zone, right? Like people were physically dumped there, right? And so like to kind of see all the over-policing and all the like experiences of our neighbors in Skid Row, it's like, oh, so this is what Chinatown must have been like 100 years ago. Like that's what it makes me think about, right? And this is the legacy that we have to live with today. The fact that we have some of the least safe streets in the county, largely because a lot of people go from downtown and cut through Chinatown streets, right, to avoid the freeways, right? I mean, I'm sure all of you have done it. I've done it. Which means that we have folks that are driving, big rig trucks driving 50 miles an hour in front of like Ann Street Elementary. So it's all of these different things that kind of exist where you need to understand the history, but it's also like that history isn't something that happened 100 years ago. It's that we're still living with the consequences today.
Is there anything you want to jump in and add?
I feel like Sissy did a great job of sharing. I just Q&As and calls to action, but
Yeah. So do you actually want to talk about the call to action?
Sure.
Which you should have, and then we'll have a couple minutes for questions, and then we're going to have to say goodbye to our online audience at 9:45, but the rest of you are welcome to stay here and continue the conversation. So Sissy, go ahead.
So I'm an organizer and activist, so I, didn't want to leave this opportunity to speak with all the congregants without having you guys do something, right? It's really easy to feel powerless, and it's really easy to feel overwhelmed, and so I find that the antidote to that is to do something, right? And so this was actually created on Friday. So apologies if it doesn't reference what happened last night. But basically, we do a lot of work around economic justice and housing justice issues. And so it is, the County Board of Supervisors has a lot of power and a lot of money to decide what they can and can't do to protect our communities, right? They determine the sheriff's budget, they determine how we spend our public health dollars, and they have money for, housing issues, right? So for example, I think they got like $1.9 billion out of federal COVID relief dollars. And, they got to decide how to prioritize that, right? And so part of what we're trying to do is get them to prioritize preventing people from becoming homeless. We have a homelessness problem largely because people can't afford rents, right? We're building so much affordable housing and housing for the homeless that if nobody became homeless today, if we were just dealing with the people already on the streets, we would house them all within 4 years. But the problem is that more people are falling into homelessness faster than we can house them, right? And a lot of it is driven by the gap between rents and wages, right? It's just working poor people or seniors on SSI or adults on disability who are getting pushed out, right? Getting pushed out of the SROs in Skid Row, getting pushed out of the Skid Row SROs in Chinatown. And so this is a call to action for you to call your county board of supervisor. So there's, different numbers here. If you don't know who they are, if you live in Pasadena, it's Catherine Barger. But if you don't know who they are, there's a link on this page too to kind of tell you where to look up your supervisor and a mini script. It'll take you 2 minutes, right? It's basically, hello, my name is Sissy Trinh. I live in Pasadena. I'm a member of All Saints Church, and I really care about low-income API issues. Please vote on these issues. Please extend COVID tenant protections. You know, make it your own, right? Feel free to. Like, this is just kind of a guide. It's not meant to be, you know, a script that you memorize.
Real quick, and I believe for those who are watching online, right, y'all can, you're gonna be highlighting this in some way?
Yep, and we're gonna post it and make sure that you have access to this.
Yeah, and Sissy, you also said that there's actually a time-sensitive vote coming up, right?
Yeah, so the County Board of Supervisors is gonna be voting on Tuesday to decide whether they wanna extend the tenant protection, the emergency tenant protections that were passed under COVID. Because a lot of families are still dealing with rent debt, and if we don't protect them, well, you know what will happen.
Yeah. I have a few minutes for questions from you all. And oh yeah, back here. Let's give you a microphone so the people online can hear your question.
Am I correct in saying that program ends at the end of this month? So literally there's one more week before that transition?
No, so they are gonna vote to decide whether or not to extend it, and they can vote to extend it an additional month, or 6 months, or a year, or they could also like choose to end it at the end of this month, but add additional permanent protections, right? So LA City Council last week voted to end the temporary protections in February, but they voted unanimously to pass permanent protections, right? So there's a lot of different routes that they could take, but you know, we need to make sure that they take them, and I know Supervisor Barger does not like tenant protections, so call her.
So I've got a question, which is, you used a phrase that I had not heard, which was they were too poor for affordable housing. Can you talk? That just like made me sort of do a Scooby-Doo. You know, what is, talk about that.
So again, lack of imagination. The assumption is if you're too poor to qualify for affordable housing, then you must be homeless. And so therefore you have access to homelessness services and homeless housing.
Well, that's super messed up.
The other
Okay.
thing too that I think you guys should realize is that this is basically any senior or on SSI and any person on disability. So that just means that as LA gentrifies, more and more people are going to be too poor to qualify for traditional affordable housing.
Thank you so much for coming and having this conversation this morning. I think if there's anything that I would really like to ask for is more cross-collaboration, more conversation between the AAPI community and the African American community, not just in the larger thing, but also at this church. I think one of the things is that we build bridges, and the bridges get accentuated by the media and all the things, the saying that we are different as opposed to why we are similar and what we have in common. And I really ask for that, to say that we cannot move forward. And I thank you for really coming here and having this, because I haven't seen these conversations before from this level, so thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You. Others, thoughts, questions? Oh.
Hi, thanks for being here. I was just wondering, could you say a little bit about the Affordable Housing Land Bank? I had not heard of that.
So it's a new tool that we advocated on and got the County Board of Supervisors to establish last year. The idea is, for those of you who don't know affordable housing development, it takes a lot of time, right? A lot of it is because it takes time to put together the money to buy land and then to build, right? And a lot of times, the riskiest part of a real estate transaction is the phase where you're trying to buy land. Because oftentimes, affordable housing developers have to assemble money from all different sources, right? So like, county, are you willing to chip in? State, are you willing to chip in? And then you have to time it all at the same time. Meanwhile, you have market rate developers who are coming in and are just like, I have cash right now, right? And so if you're a seller, obviously you're gonna just go to sell to the buyer that's can move more quickly, whose financing is guaranteed, right? As opposed to like county says yes, state says yes, and then all of a sudden city says no, and then your deal falls apart, right? And so the land bank would be a county entity that would buy land on behalf of affordable housing developers, and then they could either sell or they could give, donate, or do a lease to an affordable housing developer. So then they don't have to worry about pulling together all the money from all these different sources. You know, it reduces risk and it moves, the development along faster.
Jason, real quick, so thank you for that. Jason, I want to sort of bring you into this. You're a rapper, you're an artist, you're an activist. In every movement for justice that I've been involved in, the role of art has been one of the most powerful sort of levers. And I'd love to just ask from your perspective as an artist, what is the role of art in this struggle? Where do you see it emerging in sort of brilliance and beauty out of the AANHPI community?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Mike. My kind of formula is that art is truth represented beautifully, right? And so for me, and so in the Christian traditions, right, that's prophecy, right? That's prophecy. And I think that that art at its best has a chance to be prophetic, right? To speak truth into the world and even to change the world towards that truth. But I think particularly for AANHPI communities, like I was saying, there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect between the truth and the reality and even our own self-perceptions, which is why I think it's so important to be constantly, for art and the inspiration of it, to constantly be rooted in what's going on the ground. And there's folks doing this. My good friend Audrey Chan, we just did a fellowship together at the Japanese American National Museum. And it was a community-rooted art project. And we realized through the course of this last year at the Japanese American Museum just how vital it is to be in rooms filled with people that are doing on-the-ground work and doing representational work and doing political right. It's all one and the same. Or better yet, actually, the way I see it, it's to use Christian parlance, right? It's different organs in the same body, but it has to be the same lifeblood. And when we disconnect from each other and we float off into our own sort of little cul-de-sacs, that's when it stops being art and it starts being trend chasing and clout chasing. But what I'll say is that just as it's a myth that anti-Asian violence started in 2020, it's also a myth that Asian American Pacific Islander arts started with Fresh Off the Boat and Crazy Rich Asians. There is a really rich, in fact, 1968, right, the Third World Liberation Front, the birth of the phrase Asian American and the Asian American movement was accompanied by an outpouring of Asian American art. There was Hiroshima, right, from right here in Long Beach. There was Yellow Pearl right here, little Tokyo. And there have always been these revolutionary AAPI, AANHPI voices, and combating erasure and holding up their message as part of the movement. Super important to everything we do.
Great. We have to close down the internet part of this, and then people can stay for conversations. Jason, where can people find out more about you and your work, your website?
Everything is Jason Chu Music, CHU. So Instagram, website, jasonchumusic.com. Please, if you'd like to talk further, feel free to reach out. But I really do want to center this call to action because,
Yeah.
Jason Chu's out there. But
Right.
even more importantly,
Well, and then Sissy, before we do the call to action, can you talk about where people can learn more about SICA and support SICA?
So our website is www.seaca-la.org.
SEACA-LA.org. We'll get that up.
Yes,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you. And one more, can we just pitch the call to, you want to pitch the call to action again?
Yes, call your county board of supervisors. Tell them to extend the tenant protections and to fully fund the Affordable Housing Land Bank.
Amen. Can we just give Jason and Sissy our thanks? Thank you so much, everyone online. We'll see you in church. We'll see you all in church too, but you all